Hi, everyone. This particular lecture is about one aspect of Islam, and that is how Westerners relate, particularly non-Muslims, relate to Muslims. And the topic I want to discuss right now is called Islamophobia. That is the fear of Islam, the fear of Muslims. So one of the things I want to make clear right off the start is that this is not to say that Muslims have done nothing wrong or have never done anything to hurt people. It's not looking at, we're not going to be looking at Islamic countries that are majority Muslim countries and how they have composed themselves in relation to other countries, or how they have perhaps done things that we as Americans might see as injustices in those countries. We're not looking at the responses of Muslim majority countries to certain issues that we might be feel are important to us. Rather, what we're doing here is we're looking at the West's, by that I mean United States and Western European countries' perspectives on Muslims, Islam, and Muslim majority countries. We're looking at the perspective that Westerners have of Islam, not of what Westerners think about, or actually, I'm sorry to say, not what Muslim countries, we're not looking at the history of Muslim countries, Muslim majority countries. We're looking at Western perspectives of Islam and Muslims. So let's look at some slides. The first thing we need to do in order to understand Islam, I think, particularly from a Western perspective, a perspective of a non-Muslim, is to get our minds wrapped around the reality of what's called Islamophobia. And this is the biggest roadblock. Islamophobia is the biggest roadblock for non-Muslims to understand and appreciate Islamic tradition. So first we have to understand what are we referring to when we say the word Islamophobia? Hatred, hostility, and fear of Islam and Muslims, and the discriminatory and exclusionary practices that result. Now, a lot of people will say right off the bat, I don't fear Muslims. I'm not hostile towards Muslims. They're hostile towards me. And that tells me that actually they do fear Muslims and they are hostile and perhaps may even have hatred towards Muslims. It's not looking deep enough at our own, the way that we see the world. If there's an immediately defensive response to this statement, well, I'm not discriminatory, I don't discriminate against Muslims. That is such a common response when we talk about Islamophobia. And it doesn't require any kind of introspection at all. So the question is, do you actually want to learn something about yourself and about another culture and religion, or do you not? So the first thing is that we have to admit on some level, we may have, or just say it, we have anxiety when we see a Muslim, particularly perhaps a Muslim woman who might be wearing a hijab, or a man, whether they're Muslim or not, who is wearing a turban on their head. We might feel some fear. And even if we're not aware of it on a conscious level, On an unconscious level, we might experience some tensing in our body, right? We may be feeling some anxiety when we're around hearing Arabic spoken or chanted. So this is some things to consider for ourselves. All right? What is Islamophobia? The fear of Muslims and Islam. Why do many non-Muslims in the West have such strong feelings about Islam, even though they don't know very much about Islam? What do you actually know about Islam? And so these are some questions to kind of orient ourselves. What do you actually know about Islam that has come from a Muslim, not a Christian, not a news reporter? Have you ever heard or listened to Muslims speak about their own religion? So here are some things to consider here. If you look on the right side of the screen, these are reasons why non-Muslims, mostly non-Muslims, generate what's called Islamophobia. They actually have an incentive. There's actually an incentive for generating the fear of Islam. And look at this first in the gray here. It says, people who market themselves as terrorism experts, but who in fact get paid to promote hate. So there's a big business, there's a big industry around Islamophobia. Generating fear actually creates money. So for some people, so if we look at where these statements around Islamophobia are coming from, who they're coming from, how are these folks benefiting from speaking about Islamophobia and Islam in such a way that generates fear amongst populace? Look at the second one in orange. Far right parties and populists generate and instrumentalize Islamophobia for political gain. So in other words, if you can generate fear about Muslims, you have a better chance of getting elected. Right? If you show that, if you can demonstrate that these people over there that practice Islam are to be feared and they are a threat to our own freedoms, then people will elect you. And we see that happening. Let's look at number 3. This is from Dalia Mogahed. And she's an American woman who has Egyptian roots. And she's actually in one of your folders. She delivered a TED talk that's excellent. So if you haven't listened to that yet, make sure to listen to it. She says, deliberate campaign to misinform Western publics about Islam. So that's her definition of Islamophobia. Hatred of others is not a natural response to the unknown. This is an important point. Hatred of others is not a natural response to the unknown. It is a learned response. So hate is something that you actually have to learn. The unknown is not necessarily something bad. So the question I'm going to bring out again is, what do you know about Islam that doesn't come from non-Muslims? What do you know about Islam? Can you answer that question without referring to a non-Islamic source? And then if you cannot, then basically what you're dealing with, or what we are dealing with, is the unknown. Okay, and we can learn about what we don't know. And that helps it maybe makes the unknown a little less threatening. And then the last one, this is by an academician, John Esposito, spent most of his life studying Islam. He writes, most people in the West do not have a context to understand religious extremism. And the fact that they don't know a Muslim or much about Islam means they cannot get a clearer perspective on religious extremism and what drives it. So Religious extremism is referring to, for example, the KKK. That's a Christian form. We wouldn't call, it's a Christian form of religious extremism. The Muslim form of that would be, say, Muslims taking the helm of an airplane and driving it into the Twin Towers. Right? That's another form of religious extremism. And many Muslims would say that the people that did that to the Twin Towers are not actually Muslims. They don't follow the Muslim beliefs and practices. And in fact, there's a teaching within Islam that says, if you were to take one life of a person, you take the life of entire humanity, of all human beings. But in the West, we don't have a context to understand, oftentimes, this kind of religious extremism and where it comes from, what drives it. Why would somebody do that in the first place? So let's look at some possibilities that are connected to history. What is the history between Islam and Western countries, United States and Western Europe? So we have here, and again, this is not to dismiss what like the responses of Muslim countries or the actions and activities of Muslim majority countries. It's looking at Western countries and including the United States in that. Let's look here. In 1095, Pope Urban II orders the First Crusade. Right? So it was done initially to aid the Byzantine Emperor, and it eventually focused on taking Jerusalem and the Holy Lands back from Muslim occupied. Jerusalem and the Holy Land was occupied by a Muslim ruler, and the Pope wanted to take those lands back. You could ask the question, why did the Pope want to take those lands back? And probably the one answer that holds a lot of weight is it was a means of exercising power, gaining political power. Because if you look at the way that Muslim rulers generally treated Christians, and this is generally speaking, Christians fared better under Muslim rulers than Muslims fared under Christian rulers. Christians and Jews were, generally speaking, protected by Muslim rulers. They were considered dhimmis. And so as long as they paid a tax to the government, they would be protected because they were considered what Muslims call people of the book. In other words, people of the Bible. How did the Crusaders consider Muslims and Islam? Well, there was a lot being said about Islam in the West by non-Muslims. One of them is that Islam is a form of heresy. Well, from a Christian perspective, Islam was considered a form of heresy. And this is the kind of origination of the demonization of Islam. So it's easier to attack people if you can first demonize them. It makes it much easier to fight them and kill them if you can find ways that they are bad. And so Islam was thought to be a form of paganism, idol worship, because they saw, from a Christian perspective, Muslims were looking at Muhammad as more than just simply a prophet, but almost like the equivalent of Jesus. And for them, that was a kind of heresy. Okay, that's one way that heresy may have looked. But this is how Crusaders justified their actions, to actually fight and kill Muslims. Right? And these ideas have no basis in actual Islamic beliefs or practices. So the Prophet himself was never taught that he should be seen as God or anything like that, or that from within a perspective of Islam, that it was a form of polytheism. In other words, worshiping multiple gods, or idol worship, paganism. But let's look at, if we go a little bit earlier back, before the Crusades, you have, so Muhammad establishes Islam in the year 622, and John of Damascus is a Christian theologian. He's born 675, so about 50 years after the establishment of Islam. And John of Damascus is from Syria. This is his conclusions about Islam. First is that the Quran is not divine. It's not a divine revelation. This goes counter to what Muslims actually believe about the Quran. The Quran itself is the word of God. It's not the words of Muhammad, though it was recited through Muhammad. Muhammad was the mouthpiece of God. Muslims believe that the Quran itself is the word of God. It's the direct word of God. The second conclusion is that Muslims have a misunderstanding of God, and that worshiping the Kaaba in Mecca is idolatrous. So this is what his conclusions were. Again, this is coming from somebody who is Christian. And we need to know if we want to understand Islam in earnest, we need to hear directly from Muslims, not Christian interpretations of Islam. And we have to ask the question, what was John of Damascus's agenda here? Let's look at another Christian theologian, very famous one, Martin Luther, given great responsibility for the Protestant Reformation, right, in the 1500s, 1600s. He was born in 1483, well after Islam is established. And he's one of the few scholars who actually studied the Quran in depth. And look at his conclusions about Islam. He believed that Muslims believe Muhammad is superior to Jesus Christ, because Islam says that Jesus was just a prophet, just like all of the other prophets, but not God. And actually, they saw Jesus as from a Muslim perspective, my understanding, so it's my own limited understanding here, my understanding is that Islam, generally speaking, sees Jesus as a prophet for Western European culture. And Muhammad was initially a prophet for the non-Christian, non-Jewish cultures that started with the Arabian Peninsula, but it expanded to Eastern Europe as well as Asia and Africa. And so Muslims see Muhammad as a prophet, not only for a certain group of people, but for the entire world. And as such is the kind of seal of all of the prophets. So Martin Luther sees that, and he interprets that as Muhammad being superior to Jesus. And he also sees, he interprets Islam as being called to destroy the Christian faith, as well as the whole of Christian government. And that's not the case at all. If you look at the Quran, it's very affirming of Christianity as well as Judaism. Now, what people might do with the Quran is different. How the Quran may be used to justify wars is another subject. But if we look at the Quran itself and how Most mainstream Muslims look at Christianity and Judaism, will find a very benevolent kind of perspective here. Talk with Muslims about what their perspective is on Islam, rather than talking to somebody who is not Muslim. So the same thing is we could say about John of Damascus, we can say about Martin Luther, that he is coming from a perspective of a Christian. And if we want to understand Islam in earnest, we need to hear directly from Muslims. So we have to ask the question, what was the agenda of Martin Luther here? The reality is that there have been many we can point to positive relationships between Muslims and Christians. In the 8th and 9th century, scholars of the Christian and Muslim faith worked together to create an atmosphere that encouraged discovery and the development of new philosophical texts. So there was a whole scientific renaissance when Western Europe went into a Dark Ages period. Muslim majority countries took off in terms of science and technology. Muslim navigators actually accompanied Columbus on his voyages to the quote unquote new world, because the instruments that Muslim navigators were using at the time were considered far superior to anything that was being used in Western Europe. So Columbus made sure to have Muslim navigators on board with him. The whole idea behind optics, right? I wear glasses, and understanding the way that the eye works was found by a Muslim scientist. The idea that the mind or the eye flips its image and creates an upside down version of what it sees comes from that discovery was made possible by a Muslim scientist. So we have a lot actually to thank Muslims for. So what is Islam? If we want to know about Islam, let's hear directly from a Muslim. And this is a doctor. This is from a medical doctor. He says, excuse me, if you at least help one person seriously in your life, then you have learned something in your life. You can show your face to God that you have helped one of his creatures who was suffering. Otherwise, what is life? It won't make any sense. Dr. Saeed Hussein. So this particular Muslim is talking about the importance of helping people. And to do that, then you can show your face to God when it's time, the day of judgment comes. And this particular doctor is known for his tireless efforts of helping people, waking up at all hours of the night in order to help people who are sick. All right, so this is somebody, in other words, Islam is about a life of serving others, taking care of others. So in order to understand Islam, and as we go more deeply into it, understand the minds of Muslims, we have to get beyond our fears of Muslims, our fears of Islam, if we watch media in the United States and we do a Google search on Islam, we're going to find a lot of articles and writings that talk about things that generate fear in us. And those fears are going to prevent us from really seeing and hearing the perspectives that come directly from Muslims. So if we want to understand anything about Islam in this particular section, then we've got to acknowledge the fears that we do have about Islam and believe those that are Muslims and the voices of Muslims and what they're telling us about what Islam actually is and what it means to be a Muslim to them. Thanks for listening.